let's see. I'll just say that, just warn you that I'm going to give you a lot of information, and in many cases, every slide I could speak for about an hour about. So we're going to sort of skate through it a little bit, but on the other hand, I'm hoping to put together, connect some lines between us, some isolated dots, because a lot more is known and discussed about art in Bendigo and Castlemaine, both the art education and artists living there, and also the public galleries. And in actual fact, that Ballarat can go toe to toe with with those other cities, but there's far less public discussion about it in recent years. If you go back through the archives and the newspapers, there's a lot of discussion about visual arts culture and patronage in Ballarat. And there's a lot more Ballarat. I also should apologise because there's a lot more Ballarat artists who I should mention, but I've got a few of the key ones, and they tend to be women who've actually left the area. Some of them are born here but have moved out. But also, too, I would also say I'm aware that everything from local historians to PhD students have been researching, and gallery staff have been researching part of these areas and putting together notes and information, and I hope I'm not stepping on their toes, but I think, as I said, it's going to draw together a few lines and also make you think about the importance of visual arts and women to this area, because not only, I think everyone knows that the Central Goldfields area is a major place for arts and cultural practice and patronage, but the strong position of women, and historically strong position of women, is something that is less discussed. So now let's start off with so this is just my introductory slide, and this will give you an idea of where we're going with the talk. I'm just going to have an introduction to our theme, which is Women in the Arts in Central Victoria from the 1890s to the mid-20th century and a little bit onwards. And we're going to be looking at an expanded field of art making. I'm not just talking about people painting or people creating artworks, but I'm looking at the other areas such as art education, public galleries, and also patronage. And patronage, fundraising, sponsorship is also very important, and you can't have an art scene without having patrons. So it's a very holistic vision of the arts world that I'm speaking of. It's also something that we tend to associate with the post-1990s demands that the arts in the tertiary sector can fund themselves like STEM, and this whole idea that they're trying to, rather than talking of creativity, they talk about the usefulness of arts and arts as an economic leverage. And the interesting thing is, although we think this is a very modern thing and perhaps a twist of what art should be doing, and perhaps a sort of corruption of art, in a way, it's always been around. It's never been art has always had this sort of industrial edge, this social edge. And I think you'll understand that as we go through this. As I said, I'm talking about women's role in public art galleries and arts education in Central Victoria, what I call the cultural triangle, Ballarat, Bendigo and Castlemaine. Women also as arts patrons in the region, and also we're looking at some Ballarat-born or Ballarat region-born or even Ballarat resident artists, because a lot of artists have passed through Ballarat, and they include Eva Hopkins, Clarice Beckett, Eleanor Ritchie, Dora Olfson. I've also got Maud Glover-Flay and May Grigg. I've got May Grigg in there. Maud Glover-Flay is in there, and a couple of others that I haven't put on this list. Marley Cahoon, Hilda Rix Nicholas, May Grigg and Nornie Good. And Nornie Good was very famous in the 50s and 60s, post-war, when there weren't many professional women artists in Australia, and she was considered quite important at that stage. And she was a Ballarat person. She was actually, there's a whole family of Goods. Her father was a famous musician. She came, and her mother came from the Rayfish family. So a lot of these people, the names all sort of thread through Ballarat history, and many of you will probably know a lot more about the names and the genealogies than I do. And as I said, I was talking about an extended field of visual arts, not just making of art, art education, and the growing field of curating, art writing and arts management, which Ballarat area has always had leading women in that field. And there's been a strong tradition of professional excellence in these fields, which raises to a world-matching level throughout this central Victorian region. And this has been so since the last quarter of the 19th century in this cultural triangle. And women have often played a key part in these professional activities. And the tradition continues today with female cultural leaders and curators of national profile, which I'll just touch on a little bit. Now, we're starting off with the arts education. The School of Mines Bendigo is best known for its high standard, is the best known of all art schools in this area. It is known for its high standard of outstanding graduates a century ago. This is because of the charismatic and ambitious leader of the art school in the late 19th century. He was an English-born artist, Arthur Woodward. He firstly was recruited by the Education Department and taught at the Sale Technical College, establishing a very strong visual arts centre in East Gippsland. And then he was promoted by the Education Department from East Gippsland into Bendigo. He was a very ambitious teacher. He was also very well-informed and well-rounded. And his intention with the Bendigo School of Mines Art School was that students could go through his classes in Bendigo and then avoid the National Gallery of Victoria, go straight to Paris and straight to London, straight to Munich, where all the major art academies were. So people were coming out of central Victoria straight into the best art schools in the world in the late 19th century. And many of these people who travelled overseas from Bendigo were female students. And we also know, of course, that some students liked Woodward so much that when he moved from Sale to Bendigo, they actually upped and moved, found lodgings in Bendigo to continue training with him. And the Ballarat Technical Art School, part of the School of Mines, also equally provided a global standard of sophisticated professional art training. Its story is far less publicly visible in the 21st century and far less acclaimed. As I said, people are working on this story, and this lecture but this lecture will still draw a few lines between the dots for general public. And in fact, the discovery of late 19th century books around the Pre-Raphaelites, Ruskin, William Morris, and by associates of the Pre-Raphaelites, such as the socialist Walter Crane, from the Ballarat Technical Art School Library, which have gone through a number of permutations, including through the Ballarat Library, and they've ended up by chance basically at the art gallery. And some of these books were actually artist books illustrated by people such as Crane and Morris, and they were just there in the Ballarat Library, and they've now ended up at the gallery. But the important thing is that they were in Ballarat in the 1880s and 90s, and it also confirms, cross-references how up-to-date the training was and the art knowledge was in Ballarat in the last quarter of the 19th century. So here I'll just go through a few of these women from Bendigo. This is Agnes Goodseer, lived from 1864 to 1939. She was born in Portland, Victoria, and Western District has an interesting cluster of women artists all around at the same time, which included Agnes Goodseer, Theo Anderson, who was Theodosia, a woman. She was an associate of the Heidelberg School. Clarice Beckett, she was in Casterton. Clarice Beckett was also born in Casterton. A woman called Clarice Sanders, who was a major art dealer in 1930s Britain, and she also brought out modern art to Australia. And she was also the first high-end arts and entertainment publicist in London from about the 1940s onwards. And so she was also born in Coleraine, and also in Coleraine at the same time, and I always wonder if any of these met each other, was Helena Rubinstein. But Goodseer moved from Portland to Bendigo, again, because it was seen as an important art school, so she moved out of the sort of southwestern Victoria up to Bendigo. Then she moved between Paris and London after she finished she studied more over there after she'd finished her course at Bendigo. And then in 1921, she committed to Paris, met a wealthy American lady, as you do, and who sort of kept her in style for the rest of her life till she died in 1939. She moved in radical lesbian circles. She exhibited widely in the salons, and the British Royal Academy, and also in private galleries and other arts organisations, mostly in France, but also a little bit in England. This is her self-portrait. Her pictures are full of a wonderful 1920s styling. This is a woman with a cigarette. And the Parisienne. A lot of her pictures are actually of her companion, who was an American called Agnes. And but they're wonderful for their sort of evocation of sort of female art and style of the period, particularly sort of changing mores for women. The woman with a cigarette shows that much more sort of liberal allowances for public behaviour in the 1920s as sort of social mores freed up. But yeah, that's Agnes Goodness. Totally unknown till about 20 years ago, till Karen Quinlan brought her work to life, and now she's seen as a key figure of this generation. A similar story happens with Hilda Rix Nicholas. This is another Bendigo artist, another graduate of the School of Mines, who also went overseas and studied and worked in Paris. And this is called L'Arbre Jaune, the yellow tree. I don't think the French possibly who bought it, the curators who bought it in 1937 for the Jeu de Paume, which was the key French government avant-garde art museum, which is now closed because it's been taken over by the Centre Pompidou. This work is still there, from a Bendigo-born woman. She had an extraordinary life again and lived amongst all these radical people in Paris, although I think they probably thought it was more expressionistic than it is. It's clearly a wattle tree, but it appeared to be a rather wild idea of foliage to the French. But this is quite extraordinary to think someone who came from Ballarat. She was a daughter of a major local politician from Ballarat and a businessman who was also a funder of the Ballarat, of the Bendigo Art Gallery. But this is an interesting one. And the work was back in the 90s, some art historians from Sydney tried to track it and they couldn't find it. But this work has been now found and in the Centre Pompidou, and it's on their website. Another person from the Bendigo Art School was Louis Riggle. She was in Sale when he was teaching there. She was so upset when he left that she petitioned her father, and he was quite a wealthy pastorist, and so he sponsored her to leave home and stay up in Bendigo to finish her course with Woodward. Then she spent 2 periods in the early 1900s, late 1990s, early 1900s, studying in Europe, particularly France and Italy. She returned to Australia in between times and exhibited widely in Australia. This is an Australian pastoral scene. This is one of her best works, but it's a wonderful impressionist piece of haymaking. And then in 1914-15, with the start of the First World War, she felt she couldn't sit back and just do nothing in Australia. So she became a member of the voluntary aid detachment. She firstly worked at the Broadmeadows camp, then she followed the Anzacs to Egypt, and then later to France. Because she'd studied in Paris, she had excellent French, and so she was very useful in negotiating both with the local Egyptians, who tended to have French rather than English as their second language, and of course, once the Australian military got to France, she was extremely useful there. And she managed at one stage 10 hospitals. They were voluntary, they weren't ever paid, they were voluntary aid workers. She did minor hospital work, but she did a lot of inventory, keeping stores, buying provisioning the hospitals, but also a lot of welfare work, making sure that comforts and treats were distributed to the men, writing letters, contacting relatives. And she actually died soon after the 8th General Hospital, the Australian hospital in Rouen, was bombed. In that final push of the Germans, when they nearly, it seemed like they might have actually tipped the war the other way just before the Americans came, and she died. She didn't die of the bombings, but she probably had a stroke or something in a few days afterwards. And another Bendigo student studied in about the 1900s, 1910s with Woodward, and then she went to Swinburne briefly, and then from Swinburne and Bendigo to the Royal College of the Arts. She was one of Henry Moore's favourite students. He actually wrote her a reference, which he rarely did, the globally famous Henry Moore. He didn't really like teaching much, but he wrote her a reference about praising her ability to think in 3D and her sort of plastic sense and her ability with modelling and carving. And she was a major influence of bringing modern sculpture to Australia. So she came out of this area. The Cones, of course, were very famous in Bendigo. They were brewers and business people there, and it's a very large, between the Cones and the Levies, two very large Jewish clans, and she very much tied up with the history of Bendigo. And two, she always often say that she's the perfect Australian because she's, on the one hand, paternal side is from almost Jewish aristocracy. Their cousins were the Boleyn family, who were just below the Rothschilds. They were a shipping, the Boleyns owned a major shipping company in Germany. They're about the second wealthiest Jewish family in Germany, and they were very close to the imperial family, and they're often called the imperial Jews because they were so close to the imperial family, and which occasioned a huge amount of anti-Semitism during the First World War from the Allies, which we should be a little bit ashamed about because it was the whole thing about Germans. Not only were they cruel and nasty and they ate babies, but they were also they were always so money-grabbing and Jewish too. So, which is very interesting. It's sort of quite the inverse of what we talk about in the Second World War. And so, getting a little bit back to Ballarat and the School of Mines Ballarat, and there was a very strong female influence in the teaching staff at Ballarat between the wars. We firstly have Amali Cahoon, the photograph of the lady on the right, who was an artist who grew up in Motoa and later came to Ballarat, started off as a primary school teacher at the Redan Primary School. Then she was also going to the art school, and she went up the ranks from being a student to being a teacher. And she was considered so talented by the School of Mines that they actually, when they wanted to establish stained glass and pottery classes, extend their range, they actually paid for her tuition in Sydney in those specialist subjects, and she was given leave of absence for a year to become more educated in those areas and to come back and establish courses in these medium at the School of Mines. So that is how much she was respected at the time in the 20s. And then when she left in the late 20s, early 30s, late 20s, they advertised for an art instructor, and they appointed an artist from South Australia, May Grigg, who was a pupil of Margaret Preston and Hans Hyson. So that's her on the left. But I'll talk a little bit more about them later. But so we had and she was there from 1930 to 1946 when she returned to South Australia and got a government teaching position in the Adelaide School of Arts. So she was very, very forgotten now, but she was another major figure. So we had in Ballarat professional women teaching. Amali left and went to the Melbourne Technical College, which later became RMIT, and then she left again when she married Archibald Cahoon and established her own private art school, which she ran for 20 years in the centre of the city, in the centre of Melbourne City. And particularly when we think of women and the visual arts in central Victoria, we think of their role in galleries. Now, the Castlemaine Museum and Art Gallery was established in 1913 substantially by women artists. This is on the left is actually another School of Mines Ballarat teacher, Harold Herbert. He was there in the early 20s, and that's his watercolour of he was there in the early 20s. Harold Herbert was taught at the School of Mines, and that's his watercolour of the Castlemaine Art Gallery. On the left, we have a landscape by a woman called Elsie Barlow. She was one of two sisters who were considered very brilliant young artists in the 1890s at the National Gallery School. She, in the 1900s, was considered more talented than her sister, who's become a bit more popular. But she made the interesting decision of marrying an older widow with children. And he obviously appreciated her art. He didn't interfere with her art, but gave her a secure income. He also was a police magistrate, and he was in Ballarat firstly, and she moved to Ballarat and worked here in Ballarat. Then they moved to Castlemaine. So he gave her, and he also gave her access to government circles, and particularly vice-regal and sort of the premiers and very high up exalted people in the state who often opened her exhibitions. So marriage for her, she's unusual as a 19th century woman artist, marriage for her actually opened up more opportunities. She had been living in Ballarat, and then they moved about 1910, 1911 to Castlemaine, and she held a show in a shop in Castlemaine, and everyone thought it was so popular. She sold out. She had to paint more because she sold out, and it was so popular that people thought, well, we should have an art gallery here permanently. So she convened a meeting at her house, and a number of other people, including Alice Brotherton and also Alice Newell, who was an artist in Castlemaine, and the Lavigne family. A number of people came to the house and they decided to set up an art gallery. There'd also been a recent exhibition of historical treasures, so they thought they'd set up an art gallery in a museum. The Lavigne family gave them their first space in property that they owned, and then later they had a space above the post office. And in 1931, they fundraised to erect this building, which is one of the first modernist Art Deco buildings erected in rural Victoria. So it's quite fascinating. But Elsie knew everyone. She'd been through school with Max Meldrum, the Lindsays, Violet Teague. She knew virtually every artist in Melbourne, and she sort of used to sort of twist their arm and say, "Can you donate something to the art gallery?" And that's how the Castlemaine Art Gallery collection began, and artists still kept donating right through the 20s and 30s. A lot of their early collection wasn't bought. And the interesting thing about the Castlemaine Art Gallery was it was mostly managed by sort of local worthies and local citizens for its first 30 years of existence, including a woman called Beth Sinclair. She firstly was a sort of amateur. She firstly sort of just was on the committee of management and just sort of helped in a voluntary concern. But when she helped the gallery upgrade and actually get government recognition in the early 60s, because as they said, well, if you don't upgrade and you don't become professional, we're not going to give you any sponsorship. And she managed to get the gallery upgraded, and she managed to reorganise it. She'd been managing the gallery and she'd been managing it so professionally, and she reorganised it so professionally in the 50s that the Balti government recognised her skill, and she was promoted to being the first female public art gallery director in Australia. I haven't got a picture of her except this little image of her as a child, which is now in the Ballarat Art Gallery, the Castlemaine Art Gallery, complete with some of her children's books and things like that. But Beth was a director there from the early 60s till the mid-70s when Peter Perry came in. And she still was around gifting works, assisting the gallery, assisting with its curating right into the 90s. And of course, too, this tradition of women in the visual arts continue in central Victoria. And particularly on the right, we have Karen Quinlan, who totally repositioned the regional galleries by establishing dialogue with museums and galleries of international standard around the world, and totally reconstructed how people thought of regional galleries in Australia, that she just avoided the big, again, a bit like Arthur Woodward, she avoided the capital city sort of hierarchy and the key institutions in the capital city of Australia. She just went and dialogued internationally. So it's actually quite parallel to what Arthur Woodward did, except she was bringing in art from major museums. And she was also, her first thing she did was she discovered when some relatives of Agnes Goodseer came in and said, we've got these relatives' paintings. She said, these are amazing, and sort of promoted those for exhibitions. And that was sort of what put her on the map. And then she got this idea of going global. And of course, here's Louise Teckett, who has first person, again, repositioned the gallery, sort of made it a marriage between old and new, and made it sort of democratic and porous without overlooking the traditional arts. She's actually brought out more of the collection than the previous three directors have done. And particularly in Ballarat, there was a very strong tradition of patronage. This is the Ballarat Ladies Art Association. It was funded, they're dressed as magpies for a fundraising ball. It was for many years, it was the oldest women's art association in Australia, but there were never painters, there were fundraisers. They fundraised for scholarships for the students at the art college, money to buy art for the art gallery. They also had an annual prize-giving exhibition, which attracted major art. It was meant to be for people in the Ballarat region, but it became that it was fairly well-established artists from certainly across Victoria and also interstate came for these because of the prizes, which artists love money. They still do. They still love money prizes because it helps them with their budget. And you've also got, they also invited major artists such as Bernard Hall, John Ford Patterson, Fred McCubbin. Major artists came to judge these competitions, so that's why you've got major talent coming in to show. But it wasn't only painting, there was also embroidery, home arts, applied arts, leatherwork. So a lot of the technical typography, illustration, a lot of the things being taught at the technical college were also highlighted in these exhibitions. But they also promoted classical music. They weren't just visual arts. So they were sort of not exactly a curatorial organisation. They also promoted classical music. They sponsored concerts for major musicians in Ballarat, and also hosted receptions. And often there's lots of descriptions of people like Ada Crosley, the famous contralto, who was the sort of best Australian contralto in the era of Melba, but she'd made a promise to her father that she wouldn't ever appear on stage in costume, so she was confined to the orchestral and concert stage rather than operatic performances. And also Olga Zishy-Warnowski, who was a Ballarat-born girl who became a major violinist till she married a papal knight, and of course, like a lot of people, a lot of women of that era, gave up, once she was married, gave up her creative life. What's that? Oh, that's odd. No, I can just, it's something turned up on the computer. No. And if we think of patronage, there's also private patronage. This is the Rowe family of Naringal, who sponsored a number of artists. They used to invite artists up to their homestead, including Clarice Beckett and also Max Meldrum. The Rowe family, Maud Rowe, who was one of the unmarried daughters of the family, she particularly was enamoured of the Meldrum School, and she sponsored his lecture trips to Ballarat. This is Naringal Homestead, which is southwest of Ballarat, between Ballarat and Lismore. And this is that's the homestead now. It's a very expensive Airbnb. You have to pay several $1,000s a night to stay there. And it was until, I think about a year ago, in the hands of the same family since 1841. And this is one of the amazing paintings Beckett did there. She did some of her best landscapes up in central Victoria. Beckett became involved, met the Rowe family when she was a student at Queen's College in the 1890s. And again, thinking of families and patronages, also to the Lavinia sisters of Buda in Castlemaine. This is a picture of the again, all of these people we could talk for an hour about. This is various members of the Lavinia family outside Buda. There were artists. There was several daughters in the family, all of whom painted, drew. They were like the Lindsays. They were craftists. They worked in everything from embroidery to metalwork to woodwork. They were collectors. They collected art from across Australia, corresponded with artists. They were patrons. They sponsored the gallery. They sponsored artists. They invited artists to come and stay with them. So they were wonderful people who helped art. And most of the women were unmarried and they lived in the house. And of course, as you know, it's hardly been changed since the last sister died. And so I just thought that was another important, again, patrons, not just makers, sort of a holistic vision of the arts. And of course, if we're talking about families and art in central Victoria, we just need to briefly mention the Lindsays. And of course, Ruby is at the far left, who of course was, I think, is the nicest of all the Lindsays. Art Gallery of Ballarat is going to be soon doing a project on her. They're busy researching. I don't know how many years away it is, but she's definitely on their radar. And she is definitely one of the lead, and she's much less of an annoying character than some of the, and sort of an egoist than some of the male Lindsays, but there she is. And I just sort of, again, families, creativity, that sort of interchange between members of the families and their communities. So I just thought the Lindsays fall in here. So my final thing, I was getting down to the end of the talk, if I haven't rambled on too much. The final thing is just looking again at some women artists who lived and worked in Ballarat in the Ballarat area, late 19th century to mid-20th century. I don't know how many of these you'll know. Firstly is Eva Hopkins. She lived from 1854 to 1939. She's very much involved with the history of Ballarat. Her mother founded Queen's College, and she trained in London. She went from Ballarat to London. She trained as both an artist and a musician in London, and very talented in both areas. She was a singer, and she met someone in a choir, I think might have been at the Anglican Cathedral here, because they're staunch Anglicans, and she wanted to marry him, and her mother refused to let her marry because she was too useful and also saved her money. She taught art at Queen's College, she taught music at Queen's College, and she didn't want her to ever marry. So poor Eva never married, and then when her mother died, she sold up the Wendouree Parade House, had a final exhibition of her paintings in Ballarat, and left Ballarat and then started travelling on an independent income. But she had a number of pupils. She taught at Queen's College. Clarice Beckett was one of her most famous pupils. We don't know if this is a self-portrait or just a picture of an artist in a studio from the 1890s. Quite a lovely work and quite an unusual work to show the ambience that she worked in and the ambience of women artists working in Ballarat. And she used to have regular exhibitions of her students, both the private students and the students from Queen's College, often opened by the Bishop of Ballarat because they were very closely connected to the church. But her life was somewhat blighted by her mother. But she didn't forget her students, and if you look at the guest lists of some of Clarice Beckett's exhibition, Eva turned up to them. But as I said, she went travelling in the Pacific. Once her mother was dead, she sort of was already by that stage was sort of in her 60s, nearly her 70s, because her mother died during the First World War. But she sort of, she left Ballarat and never stopped travelling. So she was quite an independent lady finally at the end of her life. But it's a very sad story too. She was much loved by her students, but her mother was just her mother was a bit of a businesswoman and said, you're too useful. You replaced too many staff. So poor Eva had to work for her mother. This is the most amazing story. This is a woman born in Streatham who knew most of the Impressionists, knew most of the major artists in France and the US. She firstly went to the National Gallery School in the 1870s, thought the tuition was second rate, didn't like the way that they patronised women's students. She was independently wealthy, so she went to London, went to the Royal College of the Arts, and she thought that was still very much giving women second-rate tuition. It wasn't helping her with her professional life. So she got herself to Paris, where she started looking at very avant-garde art. She married an American, one of two brothers, Burge Harrison, who was the first American to have his work purchased by the French government, who was very close to all the great names of Impressionism. His brother Alexander was also regarded as a major American Impressionist, and like Mary Cassatt, sort of brokered links between the famous artists, the famous French artists, and wealthy American buyers. So she would have known all the greats of French art. She painted in France for a piece. This is the North Atlantic coastal scene in France. Rather, not so much bright and sun-filled, but much more bleak and wintry, December, January, wintry scene on the rather inhospitable North Atlantic coast of France. But then her husband got consumption, tuberculosis, so they had to come out to Australia for a drier climate, having moved through Spain and Italy. And she was in Australia for a couple of years. Then he pronounced himself cured, went back to America, and she died in childbirth in 1895. Her husband was so distraught that he burnt most of her paintings. Very few of her paintings exist now, mostly those that the family had back in Australia. So she went from Streatham to Paris and knew all the Impressionists. It's an amazing story, and we just never hear anything about that. This is another Ballarat woman. This is Dora Olfson. She was the daughter of the man who designed the Grand Reservoir. I think someone said he was also involved with designing the Olympic Theatre in Ballarat, which of course was demolished in the 1890s. She then moved with her parents when she was in her mid-teens to Sydney because he got the contract to design the Sydney sewerage system. She studied art in a little bit in Sydney, but she was also a great musician. And she was so talented that the German ambassador raised money for her to get a scholarship to Berlin. She was considered to be one of the most talented women they had seen for years there. And she was going to have a grand debut and then become sort of tour around Europe. And she got RSI, nephritis, in her arm, and she couldn't continue with her piano studies. So she didn't know what to do. So she went as a governess to Russia, and then became involved with various Russian aristocratic families. She also became the private secretary to the American ambassador to Russia. She started painting and drawing in Russia. The Tsarina Alexandra brought some of her works. She also fell in love with a Russian woman, and they decided to leave Russia and go to Rome, where she really established her practice as a portraitist, a sculptor, and a medalist. She claimed to be more or less self-taught, but she had had lessons in Germany, Australia, and in Russia. And she claimed she had a dream vision. She was also interested in theosophy that said, become an artist. A lot of her works have been lost, and she was commissioned to decorate the facade of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And then the First World War came, so the bronze was requisitioned that she was going to use for the facade. And then the trustees decided she was a difficult and demanding woman and cancelled the commission, even though she tried to sue them and all sorts of things. It's a very sad story. So she lost a major commission there. But she did become quite famous, particularly amongst people in the church, amongst aristocrats, particularly in France, Italy, and also as before the First World War in Russia. She became very close to Mussolini, and due to that, she did portraits of him, and she also designed the only war memorial after the First World War in Italy. This is at Formia, and it was only one designed by a foreigner and only one designed by a woman. On the right is her Anzac medallion. She designed this and had it cast at her own expense to raise funds for the Australian Comfort Fund. They've got this very almost proto-fascist sort of bold, simplistic design of an Anzac, and on the other side a much more sentimental, lyrical design of Australia embracing the wounded soldier. And Nellie Melba was very much involved in selling these at her concerts and fundraising concerts during the war. And you do come across these Anzac medallions. I think there could be one in the Art Gallery of Ballarat, and some of them were in gold, some of them were in bronze. But as I said, she was very close to Mussolini. Spent the war she and her partner spent the war in Italy, having great privations, lack of food, lack of fuel, as the war turned badly for Italy. And she and her partner were later found gassed in their apartment. It wasn't a suicide, it was just a faulty gas heating appliance in 1948. So that's a very sad, from all the way from Ballarat, where she was born and lived until her teens, to the circle of Mussolini. It's, again, an extraordinary story. And as I said, her father was very much, there were several other children born in Ballarat, and her father was very much involved with the Ballarat waterworks, the Grong Grong Reservoir, and other major buildings. I think he was also involved with the aborted attempt to build a grandiose public library in Ballarat. Maud Glover Flay was a student of the Technical School in Ballarat, and from her oeuvre we know that they did still life, they did landscape, there was a life class and also dressed models. So there was this complete atelier system here in Ballarat in the 1880s and 90s. And the Ballarat Art Gallery has a few of her works from very sort of juvenile, very sort of stilted young lady design watercolour work of flowers, although they're Australian native flowers, and then through to the more sophisticated work she did at the Art Gallery at the Technical College at Ballarat. And she was actually painting in the street, and David Davies saw her and thought she was quite fluid as a painter. And he said, but you're copying from another image. You should actually start painting from what you see. And so he began teaching her plein air and radical studies. She later married, stopped working. She married a chemist in Ballarat. She had 3 children, and even though she had a servant, she was working all the time. She was quite wealthy. And she then did some landscape painting, but then her younger son was very famous as a naturalist, and she began doing wildlife painting from the 30s and 40s onwards and was very famous for that. And because he was one of the first people to breed platypuses, she painted them. He was very much involved in the early Healesville sanctuary, so she had a whole colony of willing or unwilling models at hand. And of course, here's Clarice Beckett. She used to visit, as I said, she was friends with the Rowe family from her school days. She lived with her mother and sister in Ripon Street, Ballarat. I think Ripon Street North, I'm not entirely certain, because that would be closer to Queen's College. She was more known, she was noted in the press for being a violinist, but she was also drawing and painting in Ballarat, although the earliest picture we have is from the year after she was in Ballarat. But she did occasionally come up and paint with not only at the Naringal station, but also this is the Ballarat Botanical Gardens. Another, as I mentioned her earlier, Amali Cahoon was born Amali Filed in Motoa. She was a teacher in Motoa, then she came to the Redan Primary School, was learning out at the College of Mines. She was at the College of Arts, School of Mines, and she became so noteworthy amongst the students that she was offered a teaching position, and as I said, they also sponsored her for further professional training. She was particularly a wonderful figure painter. She and another friend called Dorothy Whitehead began travelling down from Ballarat to Melbourne to Elstonwick by the train, up and down once a week to study with Max Meldrum. She became very much converted to the Meldrum style, although her early work is very much different. And she was particularly good as a figure painter. Her landscapes are much more banal, but her figure painting is remarkable. The one little girl is called Rosie. She's in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, was even shown in the Archibald Prize, even though it wasn't a famous person. And she was, because of the Meldrum's interest in Velázquez, she used Velázquez's pictures of the Spanish royal family to create these very unsentimental, ungooey, sort of saccharine portraits of children, very sort of withdrawn, very dignified children. She also did a number of commission portraits, both sort of company directors and usual men in suits, but this is slightly more unusual, a woman in evening dress from the late 30s, 40s. It shows you the range of her pictures. The woman in the hat is the artist Ethel Carrick Fox in the 1940s, painted in Melbourne during the Second World War. And later she was a very close friend of Ethel Carrick Fox's, and it was acquired by the National Gallery of Victoria about 1947. And the man is a work that came up through auction. No one had seen it before. About a year ago, it sold for $14,000, way above her usual prices. This is the porter at Joel's in the 1930s. She used to she and her mother-in-law used to haunt the auction rooms. And here he is in his suit and with his dust coat over. And it's a very interesting, quite personable picture, unusual subject matter, and unusual to have a working class person rather than a middle class or upper class person in a painting of the era. And of course, look at she's allowed to be herself to be a bit bravura with the sort of images, the sort of Whistlerian paintings within paintings. I think there's an Australian one, and there's also possibly a Thames scene, but it's a lovely piece, and it got a very large price because it's so unusual and not what people generally think of as what women artists were doing at the time. But she was a very strong figure painter. She also ran an art school in the centre of the city. They set it up in opposition, in Burke Street, in opposition to the George Bell Modernist Art School. They were a much more traditional school. She and her husband lived in the school in rooms off the side. And people used to say, "But you haven't got a lovely home, Amali." And she said, "Well, look at all these other women. All you could ever say about them and put on their tombstone was that she made a good jar of jam." And she said, "That's not going to happen to me." And before I leave Amali, this, of course, she did a number of stained glass windows in Ballarat, in the Presbyterian Church in Sturt Street, I think in a number of other churches in the suburbs, Mount Pleasant, and also in the Methodist Church that's in Lydiard Street. But this is part of the windows she designed for the hall, the War Memorial Hall at Ballarat Grammar and Ballarat State School, Ballarat High School. This is for the high school. and it's still here in situ. And that was done in the mid-20s. And that one that's Dorothy Whitehead, who won the scholarship for being the best art student in the technical stream in Victoria in 1918, and she chose to go not to the Working Men's College in Melbourne, but to the Ballarat Technical College. And she was there. She was also edited at the student newspaper at the time, and later she worked as an interior designer in Ballarat. Then she too used to go down on the train with a friend, Amali Cahoon, to study with Meldrum, and like Amali, married another member of Meldrum's circle, the painter Harley Griffiths, and she taught at technical schools in Melbourne, including Paran Tech, where one of her pupils was Sidney Nolan, and she said, that guy has no talent. And she still thought he was a faker and a trickster, and she never liked him throughout her life. But it's a Meldrum piece, but there's a bit of sort of Hollywood Regency in there. And on the right is a flower piece by May Grigg, whom I spoke about, who was a speaker, who was a pupil of Hans Huyssen and Margaret Preston, taught in Adelaide for many years, but spent 16 years as a major art teacher at the Ballarat School of Mines. And of course, there's Hilda Rix Nicholas, who was she was a Ballarat-born girl. Her mother was a Sutton, and of course, the Rix family were around. She was a Hilda Rix. The Rix family was also around in Ballarat. She studied first at the National Gallery School. She was part of the remarkable generation of Edwardian women artists such as Janet Cumbray Stewart, Jessie Trail, all this Theda Lay, all these amazing, Nora Gurdon, all of these artists who were trained under Bernard Hall after 1900 and started dominating the travelling scholarship instead of the men. And she went to Paris and studied both in Paris and London, settled in Paris, painted a lot of decorative figure paintings, which attracted a lot of attention in the 1900s, 1910s, till the First World War, also painted in North Africa. She lost both her mother and her sister, who were living with her in Paris when they were caught dysentery on being evacuated early in sort of April, in August, September, after the outbreak of the First World War. And she then married an Australian officer with the AIF in London. They were married for 6 weeks, and then he got killed on the Western Front. And so she came back to Australia. She painted a whole series of paintings that she later destroyed about wartime desolation, about sort of destruction of nature in the Western Front, destruction of homes and villages. And she decided they were too depressive and people didn't like them because they weren't heroic. And she didn't get the commission to paint the murals in the State Library because what she designed was too downbeat and was anti-imperialist. And so she destroyed them. But she went back to Paris and became very popular in the 20s, particularly for her very nationalistic visions of sort of the pastoral industries, very much more usually associated with male artists, but she used to paint these images that actually put in women's contribution to the land. She then, late in life, married a man who had a large holding up in the Monaro. She moved up to the high country, had a son very late in life, which is very unusual, in the 40s, and survived. Both mother and child survived in that period in the early 30s, and he kept all her paintings all her life. She became increasingly less popular as the rise of modernism came, and she became quite outspoken and very depressed about that, and was always sort of writing rude letters to the papers and to other arts societies, as with the rise of curators and the interest in modernism. But again, her son kept all the works up at Delegate, and then it was only discovered by curators in about the 1990s. And in the last 30 years, she's now been, just like Agnes Goodseer, she's now been returned to fame and seen as an essential Australian artist, one of the best figure painters of the era. She also painted quite a lot of Anzac soldiers and military themes, as well as the anti-war themes, which have also been seen as very unusual for a woman to paint, but such a wonderful artist, such a strong sort of conservative nationalist, but really does things that very few other women actually engaged with in the period. So again, as someone born in Ballarat, to old long-standing Ballarat families, but mostly she would have done some training in Ballarat, but she mostly went straight to the National Gallery Victoria School, but then she didn't win the scholarship, so she's fairly wealthy. She went overseas and stayed in Paris. And the final person I'll mention is Nornie Good, who was she was from the Good and Rayfish families, again, very much part of the Ballarat, shall we say, dynasties. This is on the poster on the right was something she designed at the Technical Arts College at the School of Mines, advertising Ballarat, and very much a slightly Art Deco, very typical of sort of 1930s, 20s, 30s commercial art. And she later became famous after the war. She won the travelling scholarship for the National Gallery in 1942. There'd been women had won it from 1907 to 1932, and then there'd been 2 male winners, and then she won it again. She won it in 1942. She never could travel till the 1950s due to the war. She married, and so she sort of postponed her travel. So she never was recognised as much as the other scholarship winners. Art Gallery of Ballarat has acquired some works from her family just last year, which they had on display. But she was a major artist in the 50s and 60s when women artists weren't that prominent. She had this very loose, very 1950s sort of style, very graphic-y, very sort of slapdash sort of approach to watercolour. You see it in the decorative arts and graphic design of the period. People like Felix Topolsky. It was very much a popular style of the 50s, and it's very much how she painted. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll just say, let's say thank you. But I'll just show you this picture, which I sort of cut and pasted from the Courier website, which is, as I've been talking about women, art, history, culture, and patronage in Central Victoria. So we've got the president of the Gallery Association. There's Amanda. I think Amanda's. Better be polite and give you her name. Well, she's her name. I think it's Amanda McGuire, Anne Beggs-Sunter, and Louise Teggett, advertising Anne Beggs-Sunter's book on the Art Gallery Association, which is a mixed gender organisation that has also fundraised for the gallery. But thank you very much. So,